Humanity sacrificed en masse for the benefit of a stronger kind of man. That would be progress. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of history's most infamous thinkers. His irreverent, brash, and eccentric style have been etched into Western philosophy, for better or for worse. That being said, I think most people would be hard-pressed to intimate with any degree of accuracy Nietzsche's real philosophy. Even modern philosophers and scholars who specialize specifically in Nietzsche himself struggle to come to a consensus about a great many things when it comes to Nietzsche's actual positions. Keeping that humbling fact in mind, today we will venture into Nietzsche's most systematic work on the Genealogy of Morals and attempt to translate it into layman's terms. Hopefully by the end of this video, we can illuminate the core thrust of the work and uncover the root of Western morality itself. I am the Layman, and this is on Nietzsche's Genealogy. Before we begin, it's important to understand what Nietzsche actually sets out to do with this work. What is genealogy in the first place? Well, genealogy is the study and tracing of family trees. Think Ancestry.com. It's like you're tracing a lineage. In the same way that you may examine your genealogy to see if there's anything that can help you get into college, Nietzsche examines the genealogy of our moral language, and by extension, morality itself. Where does our modern sense of morality come from? Is it grounded in anything objective, anything real? Is morality a necessary constraint or a superfluous impediment to our true potential? These are the types of questions that Nietzsche sets out to answer in the Genealogy. The book itself is divided into 3 essays, and we will, for the most part, be taking them sequentially and attempting to tie it together at the end. Now, to the text. In the first essay, entitled Good and Evil, Good and Bad, Nietzsche sets out to discover the etymological origins of the good. If you're not familiar with etymology, etymology is the study and tracing of the origins of words. In modernity, we often conceptualize a good act as one that is selfless. Traits like empathy, compassion, servility, these are part and parcel of what we consider today to be good. But was this always the case? Nietzsche's not convinced. He argues that the concepts of good and bad arise originally as a consequence of class disparity between the nobility and subservient classes. He refers to this class disparity as a pathos of distance and explains how, from a sense of power and superiority, aristocrats characterized themselves as noble, as right, and as good. Conversely, that meant that all those who were ruled over were characterized as degenerate, inferior, and bad. It's important to note that this conceptualization doesn't claim to be objective. It's more of a matter-of-fact assertion. This is how it is, so this is how it ought to be. That was something of the justification. Now, what evidence for this claim does he provide? That the first conceptualizations of good and bad arise from this pathos of distance? Well, he cites a number of Latin and Greek words that serve as the etymological origins of good and bad. It's important to keep in mind that Nietzsche was German and consequently wrote in German, so the origins of our English moral language may differ slightly, but he does note that there's a lot of overlap, generally, in the etymological roots of these words across languages. He cites agathos, which means good, well-born, noble, brave, or capable. Estlos, which means one who is, who has reality, who is true, then truthful, and then later noble. Kakos, bad, ugly, ill-born, mean, cowardly, worthless. And delos, cowardly and thus despicable, low-born, miserable, wretched. We can see that generally those words denoting good carried with them a sense of superiority, a courage, and nobility, while those denoting bad contained a sense of cowardice and vulgarity. So we've established this first conceptualization of good and bad, not as a moral claim per se, but rather as a status quo preserving observation that juxtaposes the nobility versus the servility. We'll refer to this framework as aristocratic morality. Nietzsche himself uses about 10 different terms for it. He calls it master morality, aristocratic knightly morality, noble morality, but to be consistent, we'll just use aristocratic morality. The second conceptualization of good and bad, more accurately denoted as good and evil, is a complete inverse of this class-based framework. It arises primarily from the resentment of the lower classes. It attempts to overturn aristocratic morality and elevate all that was previously conceived as low. Meekness, servility, selflessness, these traits are now to be held as laudable. And not only that, but now those aristocrats and nobility who rule, who exercise their power, are to be held in contempt as morally corrupt, as evil. Now here, as opposed to aristocratic morality, we have a moral judgment that attempts to ground itself in a true notion of morality. Nietzsche lays this turning of the tables primarily at the feet of Judaism. To quote Nietzsche, "It was the Jews who, in opposition to the aristocratic equation, ventured with an awesome consistency to suggest the contrary equation, and indeed to hold fast with the teeth of the most profound hatred to this contrary equation, namely, the wretched are alone the good. The poor, the weak, the lowly are alone the good. Nietzsche and Nietzschean scholars often refer to this framework as slave morality, so we'll stick with that as well. So now we have before us the two conceptualizations of morality that Nietzsche finds historical precedent for: slave morality and aristocratic morality. He goes on to explain how, through the development and dissemination of Christianity, which he describes as the crown jewel of resentment, aristocratic morality has lost the battle. Even the great Roman Empire, so idolized by Nietzsche for its masculine, its powerful, its courageous spirit, was subdued by slave morality. As a result of nearly 2,000 years of the slow infection of slave morality, Europe has been inexorably dulled. In this ideological battle of Rome versus Judea, Judea won, which is ironically symbolized by Rome becoming the new center of the church. Nietzsche laments how tame, how feminine, and how sedated his nation and his continent have become. If it's not already clear, Nietzsche vastly prefers the earlier aristocratic conceptualizations of good and bad to the oft theologically grounded conceptualizations of good and evil, though he does at least credit slave morality with deepening the psyche of man through frequent inward reflections, to do mostly with bad conscience, but we'll get to bad conscience in a second. He is in desperate need of a new type of man, one who is courageous, vigorous, triumphant, even one who inspires fear. A courageous, vigorous, fear-mongering German. I wonder if there's anyone like that in the 20th century. I think the most useful way to categorize Nietzsche's views on these moral frameworks is to cash them out in terms of strength versus weakness. I'd be remiss if I didn't add that Nietzsche isn't exactly a believer in free will, and we won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but I do bring that up as context for the following. To demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a wish to overpower, a wish to conquer, a wish to become master, a lust for enemies, resistance and triumphs, is just as absurd as to require of weakness that it should express itself as strength. The strong, the powerful, the courageous would obviously prefer and benefit from a conception of morality that's not grounded in any metaphysical or religious reality. The weak, on the other hand, seek some justification for their suffering, even if it means that they must rely on the ultimately ineffable idea of cosmic justice. While the former is a result of aristocratic instinct and a feeling of nobility, the latter purports to be grounded in a metaphysical reality. Aristocratic morality sees bad as an admittedly subjective descriptor for what it generally disdains, but slave morality asserts evil is a real phenomenon, something true, something grounded in the existence of an external world. Now that we've established this basic dichotomy of aristocratic and slave morality, let us move on to the second essay, Guilt, Bad Conscience, and Related Matters. Nietzsche prefaces this essay by outlining what he refers to as the paradoxical task which nature has set itself in regard to man, the creation of an animal that is free to promise. We'll walk that out over the course of this chapter, don't worry. Nietzsche, in laying the necessary interpretive groundwork for this chapter, details the processes of forgetfulness and memorization and how the interplay of both are necessary for the development of the species. He describes forgetfulness as the nurse of psychological order, an active force that allows us to digest and deal with just as much as we're capable of. Memory, on the other hand, is characterized as an active refusal to get rid of something. In order to make promises, in order to project into the future, because that is what you're doing when you make a promise, one must commit the will to continuity. The necessary precondition for being able to project into the future, however, is predictability. You can't effectively project into an unstable and uncertain future. If, for example, I believe that both my personal life and society will be relatively stable over the next 50 years, then maybe I'll opt to invest some money in the market now, fully expecting that I'll be able to reap the benefits of that later down the line. If, on the contrary, I think we're on the brink of war or some other catalyst of uncertainty, I'll probably opt to prioritize the present and keep that money. So we have this interplay of forgetfulness and memory, and in order to make promises, both man and broader society must become predictable and stable. Got it. But how do we get to this point of relative predictability? After all, Nietzsche describes early man as largely unable to master memory, more akin to animals than modern humans. There is one thing, however, that nobody forgets, and that is pain. Something must be burned in so as to remain in his memory. Only that which never stops hurting will remain in his memory. Pain is the ultimate mnemonic, and thus cruelty and suffering were inflicted in the name of memory. In fact, Nietzsche argues that this is one of the core parts of punishment itself. Punishment is not enacted for the accused, but for everyone else, so that they may look upon the punished and remember what happens to those who deviate. Memory didn't arise out of the keeping of things one ought to do, or might do, or should do, but rather from a handful of thou shalt nots, seared painfully into the collective psyche. Let us move now to guilt, or bad conscience as Nietzsche refers to it as. He argues that the etymology of language surrounding guilt and punishment can be traced to what are basically economic creditor and debtor terms. The guilty are, of course, the debtors, whereas the ones who are owed are the creditors. It's easy to see the relationship between the economic and the moral language, as both someone who owes a financial debt to someone and someone who owes a moral or ethical debt are likely to experience a similar feeling of obligation. He emphasizes that it was, and still often is the case, that the creditor takes extreme pleasure in exacting payment from the debtor. So where does guilt fit into all this? Well, Nietzsche purports that guilt is the psychological state of the debtor, and it doesn't arise as a result of a deviation from some true moral path, but rather from the clashing of natural instinct and societal strictures. See, Nietzsche recognizes that societies and civilizations have to form in order to make man predictable so that he may promise, as previously iterated, but simultaneously, the foundation of these very civilizations necessitates the suppression, at least to a degree, of our natural drives and instincts. Nietzsche describes bad conscience as fundamentally arising out of the instinct for freedom forced into latency. Before we get to Nietzsche's solution to this problem, there's one more aspect of bad conscience that we ought to touch on. The previously discussed creditor and debtor dynamic can be applied across the generations, construed as the present owing a debt to their ancestors. There are numerous examples of this phenomenon, such as tribes offering prayers and sacrifices to their ancestors. If crop yields were poor or if disease spread rampant, it was often attributed to the wrath of the ancestors. Resultantly, even more sacrifices and prayers would be offered. And if the tribe or people were thriving, this was attributed to the goodwill of the ancestors, and thus the indebtedness to them increased even more. Over enough time, the ancestors are essentially converted into deities. Hell, even we in America have lifted our founding fathers to near mythical status. Following this line of reason to its logical conclusion, we arrive at the realization that the greatest conceivable creditor is the Judaic God of all, the singular creator of all things, the one who is responsible for all being and becoming. How could we, mere men, ever repay such a debt? This, Nietzsche says, is where the genius of Christianity comes in. Because who but God himself could pay this debt for us? And that is just what he does. The crucifixion of Christ is the payment of the collective debt of humanity. God himself pays our debt out of love. This is why Nietzsche thinks Christianity is so attractive, why it has become the choice narcotic of the West. This self-sacrificial act of God, of course, does not do away with bad conscience. In fact, it makes Christians feel even more indebted to God. And of course, this does nothing for those who didn't believe in God in the first place, but even they are still subject to bad conscience through societal norms clashing with primitive instinct. So now that we've laid out the origins of bad conscience, what is Nietzsche's solution? Well, first, he believes that we have to reject this idea of indebtedness, full stop. In Nietzsche's view, we don't owe anyone anything. In a later work of his, entitled Twilight of the Idols, he describes an ideal man as one that is accountable to no one but himself. A necessary component of this is, of course, the disillusioning of oneself from the belief of God, particularly the Judeo-Christian God. Nietzsche even admires the old Greek pantheon of gods. He sees them as affirmations of power, of strength, and instinct, as opposed to the Judeo-Christian God, which he describes as giving rise to a hatred of the flesh. Likewise, the Greek gods saw misdeeds by man not as a result of sin, but as a result of folly. They didn't fault bad acts by man as a blot on their soul, but as a mere result of not knowing any better. This idea is a cornerstone of Nietzschean morality, which is an oxymoron if there ever was one. So, the Nietzschean denies the Judeo-Christian God, denies guilt, bad conscience, and indebtedness of any kind. But what does he embrace? Well, he embraces those traits lauded largely by aristocratic morality: strength, power, adventure, nobility, courage, animalistic instinct, pride. These are the traits of Nietzsche's savior. For such a consummation, we need spirits of an altogether different sort than seems really likely to be found in this age. Spirits strengthened through wars and victories, for whom conquest, adventure, danger, even pain have become needs. We need habituation to crisp mountain air, to winter journeys, to ice and crags. We even need a kind of sublime malevolence, a supreme and self-conscious insolence regarding our knowledge. He goes on. This Antichrist, an anti-nihilist, this conqueror of God and of nothingness, he must one day come. It is only now that we have the interpretive tools to understand what Nietzsche meant by the quote that I began this video with. Humanity sacrificed en masse for the benefit of a stronger kind of man, one that could flourish. That would be progress. I forgot the last word. And with that, we move to the final chapter of Nietzsche's genealogy. What do ascetic ideals mean? If you're not familiar with asceticism, which is the topic of this chapter, It's not to be confused with asceticism. Asceticism is a commitment to a minimalistic existence, largely characterized by sobriety, fasting, chastity, and limited social interaction. Asceticism, on the other hand, is having 50 different mood boards on Pinterest. The most common form of asceticism is religious. The image of Christ fasting in the desert, of course, instantly comes to mind, or St. Anthony donating all his possessions and retreating, like his savior, into the desert. But asceticism doesn't have to be religious. There's artistic asceticism, philosophical asceticism. Hell, even women can be ascetics. His words, not mine. For all these different groups, though, asceticism represents something very different. For the artists, for example, asceticism means nothing at all. Or do they mean so much that it is if they have no meaning at all? Thanks, Nietzsche. That's really helpful. Frankly, his discussion of artistic asceticism here has little bearing on the core thrust of the work. He spends most of this part berating Richard Wagner for converting to Catholicism, so we won't stick around on this point. Anyway, philosophical asceticism is relevant to our exploration. Many philosophers have found ascetic ways of living attractive. He cites Schopenhauer, who believed treating into contemplation was the only reprieve from the excruciating churning of the will. Other examples come to mind as well, such as one of my favorite philosophical characters, Diogenes, who owned nothing and lived in a jar. If only our modern vagrants were more of the philosophically ascetic type and less of the stab you with an AIDS needle type. And of course, if I asked you to imagine a philosopher, you'd probably conjure an image of someone living alone on the top of a hill, largely unconcerned with day-to-day affairs. But why is this mode of being so attractive to the philosophical types? Nietzsche believes that every being strives toward the conditions that will allow it to harness its greatest potential power. Every animal, including the philosophical beast, strives instinctively after the most favorable conditions, those under which it can exert its full strength and experience its greatest feeling of power. Philosophers embrace asceticism simply because it's the most optimal condition through which they can achieve their creative and intellectual zenith. Philosophers don't participate in poverty, humility, or chastity out of a sense of virtue, but simply as a means to an end. It's not a hatred of the flesh that philosophers embrace, but a necessary appropriation of all of their energy into the philosophic enterprise. Now, it goes without saying this is not true of all philosophers. Some, like the hedonist, embrace ways of living that are antithetical to asceticism, but Nietzsche is talking more so about the philosophical archetype than he is any particular philosopher. So that's philosophical asceticism, but what about religious asceticism? If Nietzsche doesn't have a problem with it in a philosophical context, why would he have a problem with it in a religious context? Well, Nietzsche understands religious asceticism to be something very different. He sees it as a direct refutation to life, a no to the here and now in exchange for some eternal reward, which of course he thinks is foolish. He sees religious asceticism as a construal of nature versus God, and if that's the dichotomy, Nietzsche will always choose nature. As someone inclined to the natural sciences, as a student of Darwin, Nietzsche asked the question, why would evolution give rise to the type of person, the priestly ascetic, who seems so opposed to the typical instincts that would allow a species to flourish? This priestly ascetic name is one that he gives to religious ascetics at large, but sometimes also uses it in a context focusing specifically on priests. It's context dependent. Why is there such a large group of people that find religious asceticism attractive? Now, here you have to remember Nietzsche was writing 150 years ago when this type of religious asceticism would have been much more prevalent. I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone from my high school that became a monk. He even says that if aliens were to come and observe Earth, they would find it to be an increasingly ascetic planet. Aliens for real watch us go from monastic temperance to DoorDash and OnlyFans. It's so over. Anyway, back on track. To get to the answer to this, we have to follow Nietzsche down a bit of a rabbit hole. Nietzsche, as we've already established, believes that individuals have a natural inclination to strength or weakness. The strong, he argues, are not threatened by the strongest, but instead the real threat to strength arises from weakness. From the soil sown by the weak and sickly arises vindictiveness and conspiracy, moral aggrandizing, and covert spite. But who will lead and take care of these low and these sickly individuals? Certainly not the strong. The risk of contracting an illness of the psyche such as theirs is to be prevented at all costs. No, instead the doctors, the physicians, the leaders must be of the same degenerative type. This is the role of the priestly ascetic. Their job is to serve as shepherds to these sheep, and primarily, he serves to direct their resentment. See, resentment is a dangerous thing, and unchecked resentment in a group of disenfranchised individuals tends to bubble up and cause problems. That is why the role of the priest is so important. His job is to diffuse this resentment before it explodes. But how does he do this? By directing the resentment inward. I suffer, someone is to blame. All sick sheep think this. But his shepherd, the ascetic priest, says to him, "Quite so, my sheep. It must be the fault of someone. But you yourself are that someone. You alone are to blame. You yourself are to blame for yourself. That is bold enough, false enough, but one thing is at least attained thereby, as I have said. Resentment is diverted." Now the ascetic priest is justified on an evolutionary basis. He's evolved to contain and direct the sick so that the strong are free to promise. Nietzsche almost seems to accept the ascetic priest as a necessity in the sense that they serve as a check on the collective power of the weak, but there is a more bitter and harmful kind of sacerdotal medicine. Through the illusion of guilt and sin, the sick are psychologically punished more and more until eventually they reach an emotional excess that has not only negative psychological consequences, but physiological ones as well. See, Nietzsche thinks psychological sickness and physiological sickness are inseparable. So when he uses this term sick to refer to religious societies or other kinds of weakness of character, he means not only a sickness of the mind, but a sickness of the body as well. He even goes so far as to suggest that death and disease spread much faster in sacerdotal societies and describes religion as the supreme disaster of European health, akin to alcoholism. Where philosophical asceticism is a means to a more powerful end, religious asceticism's end is physiological and psychological weakness achieved through the means of guilt and bad conscience. Where then are we to find an antidote to this religious decadence? If the first thing that comes to mind is science, think again. In fact, Nietzsche describes science as merely the latest and noblest form of that same asceticism. But how is this the case? If science is supposed to be a rigorous, systematic, and unbiased exploration of the world, how does it still not manage to escape this commitment to ascetic virtue? The answer is through its implicit commitment to truth. You see, every form of science contains its presuppositions, its axioms taken for granted, without which it would cease to be intelligible or useful. And almost all forms of science retain as an axiomatic presupposition the belief in the divinity of truth, a belief which Nietzsche critiques as fundamentally Platonic and then Christian. Christians believe that way down at the bottom of everything there exists a truth, and that truth is God. The belief in an intelligible world that humans can interpret and through interpretation approach the divine is, of course, a Christian one. After all, Christ describes himself as the way, the truth, and the light. If I am ever to solve an enigma, let it be this one. For some time past there have been no free thinkers, for they still believe in truth. Then how is one to escape this religious commitment to truth? Nietzsche's answer? Abandon it, or at least abandon allegiance to truth as the ultimate value. The irony in all this is that Nietzsche believes Christianity's commitment to truth will be the exact thing that does away with it. After Christian truthfulness has drawn one conclusion after the other, it finally draws its strongest conclusion, the conclusion by which it must do away with itself. This, however, happens when it asks the question, what is the meaning of desire for truth? As is the self-destructive tendency of all things, Christianity will destroy its own morality in pursuit of truth, and Nietzsche prophesizes that, resultantly, the next 2 centuries in Europe will be both terrible and pregnant with hope. As far as the terrible is concerned, he was spot on. And to conclude, Nietzsche answers the question that he posed with the title of this chapter. What do ascetic ideals mean? The answer? They provide a meaning for suffering. Up until now, the ascetic ideal has been the only meaning provided to man. And while Nietzsche has spent the entirety of this chapter outlining the issues with asceticism, even he admits that a poor meaning is better than no meaning. Man would rather desire oblivion than not desire at all. This book is an examination and explanation of humanity's moral instinct, how it developed, and how it has shaped our collective psyche. Nietzsche rages against the decay of Europe, attributing it to the spread of Christianity and ascetic ideals, while proposing the abandonment of intrinsic morality and truth, and emphasizing a primitive instinct, strength, and nobility akin to that of aristocratic morality. It goes without saying that if any of the ideas in this video piqued your interest, I highly recommend reading the Genealogy for yourself. I think Nietzsche is one of the most fun and entertaining philosophers to read, and the writing of this essay reminded me how impossible it would be to include all the necessary nuance in every one of his arguments. So the only way that you're going to get that is actually exploring the text for yourself. If you have read it, what do you think? Personally, I'm a Catholic, and so I disagree with almost everything Nietzsche puts forth in this book, and I'll likely do a video on that sometime in the future. But for now, I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you, my fellow layman, in the future.